Welcome, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors, Voice of Corporate Governance. I'm Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. I'm here today with Ali Zimmerman, the Madeline Duncan Rowland Associate Professor of Business Administration at Florida State University. Professor Zimmerman is the co-author of a recent research paper entitled A Tale of Three Perspectives: How GNFs, Annual NAFs, and Triennial NAFs experience the PCAOB inspection deficiency remediation process. Welcome, Professor. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the opportunity to share my research on the PCAOB with you and the listeners of this podcast. I'm really excited to dig into this important topic for global capital markets.
So, Professor, your research paper discusses the results of interviews you've had with 29 partner-level professionals about their experience with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's inspection remediation. So, before we discuss those results, can you provide our listeners, many of whom are not accountants or auditors, some background and an overview of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB's inspection program, and what is meant by GNFs, NAFs, and remediation of PCAOB inspections?
Thank you for that question, Jeff. So to give you a little bit of background, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 mandated the creation of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or PCAOB. It mandated that the PCAOB oversee the audits of public companies in order to protect investors and the public interest. And the PCAOB was also charged with creating auditing standards for auditing public companies, inspecting them, and enforcing its standards. So to explain what those acronyms mean, GNF, NAF, and what the term remediation means, I'll tell you a little bit more about the PCAOB's inspection program. So when I say inspection, I mean they're auditing the auditors. So for U.S. audit firms that audit SEC issuers or registrants, the PCAOB has two main inspection programs. The one is GNF is for global network firms. So that includes the Big Four audit firms plus two of the largest non-Big Four firms, Grant Thornton and BDO. Now, NAF stands for non-affiliate firms, and that's for the rest of the non-Big Four firms in the US. And the NAF program is actually split into two, essentially. There's a group of the larger non-Big Four firms that audit more than 100 SEC registrants, and those are inspected annually. And then the rest of the NAF firms or non-Big Four firms that audit less than 100 issuers, they get inspected at least once every 3 years or triennially. So hence we have the GNF firms, the annually inspected NAF firms, and then the triennially inspected NAF firms. And this is all mandated by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that the PCAOB inspect firms either annually for the larger firms that audit over 100 issuers or triennially for the smaller audit firms. So then comes the word remediation. What exactly do we mean by remediation? So the other thing that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act mandated is that the PCAOB try to help improve audit quality. And in its inspections, if it identifies any deficiencies in the audits in terms of following PCAOB audit standards or rules, it'll issue comments and it'll put those in a public inspection report. Those are Part 1 comments. And there's Part 1A comments that are the more severe, where the audit opinion wasn't supported. And then there's less severe comments called Part 1B comments. And so there's also quality control comments. So those are related to the firm as a whole. If the firm has systemic sort of pervasive issues, those are called quality control deficiencies, and those will need to be remediated as well. And the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, interestingly, says that the quality control deficiencies in Part 2 of the inspection report are not put out for the public consumption unless the firm fails to remediate those deficiencies 12 months after the inspection report is issued, those comments are issued. So the firm has 12 months to remediate its quality control deficiencies. And if it doesn't do that to the satisfaction of the PCAOB, then those Part 2 inspection comments related to quality control deficiencies get released to the public. So remediation essentially means the process of correcting deficiencies, either engagement level deficiencies, where it's issues related to a specific audit engagement that was inspected, or quality control criticisms that relate to the firm's audits as a whole.
Professor, your research indicates that there are a number of important differences in how public company audit firms of different sizes perceive their interactions with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board inspectors. So can you discuss those research findings that you believe are of particular, should be of particular interest to long-term investors in public companies?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the core of our research and our findings is these differences that we identified. So we interviewed partners and consulting professionals that help audit firms remediate deficiencies in our study. And we asked independently partners from the larger firms, the GNF firms, the annually inspected NAF firms, and the triennially inspected NAF firms, just to tell us about their experiences going through the remediation process. And what we heard from each group of individuals, of partners, was starkly different experiences. And this punchline, the story that we wanted to communicate in our paper. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about those challenges. The first challenge we heard was communication challenges. For the GNF firms, those partners told us that they had frequent and constructive communication with dedicated PCAOB teams. So the inspection teams that each GNF firm was assigned typically was the same year after year, and they're getting inspected annually. So they're having more frequent and more constructive communication with a dedicated team of PCAOB inspectors. And interestingly, at the GNF firms, it's usually the national office specialist experts at the firm rather than the individual auditors on the engagement team that are doing the communication with the PCAOB. And that communication tends to be smoother because these national office experts, a lot of them actually came from the PCAOB. They used to be PCAOB inspectors. So when these national office experts at the firms communicate with current PCAOB inspectors, their communication is more constructive and smoother because they're talking to people like themselves and they understand each other's language. Now, at the NAF firms, the non-Big Four firms, whether they're annually or triennially inspected, we heard a different story from the partners when they described their remediation experience. We heard that they perceived a limited and inconsistent and rather unhelpful communication with the PCAOB, including difficulties getting timely feedback and guidance, and they felt like lack of support and frustration. One of the issues that we identified as people were talking was that their inspection teams and remediation teams, which were different individuals, tended to change year after year, whether they were annually inspected or triennially. Now, for the annually inspected NAF firms, there were some more consistencies there where they had like quarterly meetings and more consistency than the smaller firms, that triennially inspected firms, in terms of who was on their inspection team and remediation team. So it was a little easier for them if they're annually inspected. For triennial firms, they're getting inspected every 3 years, sometimes every 2 years. It kind of just depends. But certainly their inspection team and remediation team at the PCAOB that they were dealing with tended to change year after year. And they felt like they were just getting little to no guidance from the PCAOB. Now, the PCAOB generally is not there to necessarily like provide guidance. They're there to inspect, issue the deficiencies, and it's up to the firm to figure out, what do they need to do to fix their deficiencies, because every firm is different and every deficiency is different. So that's true for all the firms, but what we heard from the NAF firms is just starkly different from the experience the GNF firms had, even though technically it's the same auditing standards and the same processes. So that's the communication challenges we heard. And then for investors, this disparity in communication kind of raises concerns about the consistency and effectiveness of the PCAOB oversight process across the different tiers of firms. So if smaller firms even perceive that they're not receiving adequate support or guidance, even though on the PCAOB's end, it might not be true, that perception is their reality. And that could potentially impact the quality of the audits for the companies these NAF firms audit. The other challenge we heard was timing. And all the firms felt frustration with the timing of the inspections and when the inspection reports were issued. But the NAF firms felt that timing constraint more acutely. And I'll explain what I mean here. So the PCAOB will tend to inspect the larger firms, the GNF firms first, starting March or April after the audits are completed for December year-end issuers. And so they'll start with GNF inspections, and then they'll move into NAF inspections later in the year. At least they tended to. So our data was collected over several years, and our interviews took place during and after the pandemic. And so things might have changed now, and we hear improvements from the PCAOB. So I'll definitely talk about that later. But in terms of the timing and inspection reports, it was taking a while for the PCAOB to get those reports out. And the NAF firms were hesitant to start remediating until those reports came out. For the GNF firms, those reports tend to come out earlier in the year, and they can start remediating early. Although the GNF firms learned quickly that they should just start remediating the deficiencies that they were told about in their meetings even before the inspection report comes out. But for the NAF firms, they didn't want to start remediating until they got the report, they got the actual comments, and knew exactly what the issue was. So those reports tended to come out later for NAF firms. So they might not even come out till November or December, or even like January or February of next year, when they've already done the planning, even started some of the field work for next year's audits. However, the PCAOB expects them to remediate the deficiencies in next year's audits. And so the NAF firms felt like they're in a catch-22 to try to remediate those deficiencies in an audit they already started. And they felt like they would then get dinged again next year's inspection for the next year's audits because they didn't have time to remediate them. So as far as investors should be concerned, this backlog of inspection reports taking a long time to come out, they need to understand that affects how quickly those deficiencies will get remediated by the firms. So a backlog of unresolved audit deficiencies could potentially affect audit quality at those firms. But it seems like there's something about the PCAOB's process in terms of the issuance of these reports that's kind of undermining the annual NAF firms and the triennial NAF firms' ability to remediate those deficiencies promptly and then avoid getting the part 2 of their inspection report later released, because if they don't remediate to the satisfaction of the PCAOB, that's what happens. The part 2 gets released.
Professor, some have criticized several aspects of your research paper, including 1, your paper mischaracterizes the process firms must go through to fix flaws found by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board inspectors. And 2, your research paper's conclusions are based on interviews with a small fraction of public company audit firms. So what's your response to those criticisms of your research paper?
Jeff, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to respond to those criticisms. So regarding the criticism that the paper mischaracterizes the process the firms must go through to fix flaws found by PCAOB inspectors, for that, we would say that regardless of what the process actually is, the perceptions of audit partners is important to recognize. So the responses that we heard in our interviews was the participants' reflection of their understanding of the process. So if that understanding or perception deviates or differs from the PCAOB's actual processes, the fact that there is this difference in perception is important to acknowledge and try to address. So the paper also acknowledges that the PCAOB's and the SEC's perspective is that some of the perceived differences experienced by the smaller firms, the NAF firms, are in part at least attributable to the nature of the smaller firms. Certainly, the smaller firms don't have as extensive of a national office or a national office at all to liaison with the PCAOB. And that might be part of the difference in their experience, is that the engagement teams, the audit partners, directly communicate with the PCAOB at the smaller firms versus the national office experts communicate with the PCAOB at the GNF firms. Also, the smaller firms certainly have less resources, and that may be part of their concerns or challenges in remediating deficiencies, not just communication with the PCAOB or the timing of the PCAOB's inspection reports, but still, their perception is that there's perhaps some inequities in the PCAOB inspection process, such as having different inspection teams every year or every time they get inspected. And the other issue we heard was that folks that were inspecting NAF firms, inspectors, tended to come from the GNF program and sort of bring in their GNF or large firm biases in terms of how those firms operate and bring in those expectations to a smaller firm, even though a smaller firm is not necessarily set up that way. And so they felt like the inspectors didn't know the smaller firms as well and felt like they were expected to operate the same way as larger firms, even though that's not how they were structured. We also acknowledge in the paper that the perceptions and interpretations and responses of the smaller firms, annual and triennial, are inconsistent with the PCAOB's expressed intentions. And again, we call for the PCAOB to try to identify why there's this difference in what their processes are and what the smaller firms perceive their processes to be. The other issue that was raised as a criticism was that our conclusions are based on a small number of interviews, 29 interviews. Is that really representative of the population of audit firms and their perceptions and experiences? Now, I want to explain our research method and how it follows, conventions for that type of research. So we use the qualitative research method, semi-structured interviews. And the purpose of that research was to answer the why and how, and not necessarily the what. We wanted a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the phenomenon and ability to dig into people's experiences and analyze them through a theoretical lens. So even though we interviewed 29 professionals, those professionals came from all three types of firms, and there were 16 firms represented in total. Also, we kept interviewing folks until what we call saturation or theoretical saturation happened. So that means that no new themes emerged in subsequent interviews. So we could have kept interviewing more and more partners and individuals about their experiences. But if we weren't hearing anything new in their experiences and the themes that we identified, we felt like that would not be a good use of their time to continue to interview folks if we were going to hear the same thing. So we wanted to be respectful of people's time. Now, the other thing that we did was we interviewed consulting firms that were started by former PCAOB inspectors. These firms now help audit firms, particularly NAF firms, design their quality control systems, and they help them get through PCAOB inspections and remediate deficiencies. So we interviewed 4 professionals from 3 different consulting firms. And so these consulting firms help a lot of different NAF firms. And so by not only interviewing audit partners from all 3 types of firms, but also interviewing partners that used to be, or consultants that used to be inspectors and work with a lot of different firms, that helps us make sure that what we heard from the partners is not just idiosyncratic to their experiences, because what we heard from the consultants was that the experiences that we heard from the partners were true, or they heard that same sort of experience on their end when they were consulting these partners. The other thing I want to mention is that over half of our interviewees had experience across multiple types of organizations. So many of the annual NAF and some of the triennial NAF audit partners that we interviewed had previously either worked at the PCAOB or at a Big Four firm or at another type of firm. So they were able to draw on their experiences working at different types of firms or the PCAOB. So I hope that adequately addresses the criticism, and I'm happy to chat more if you have any other questions on that in that regard.
Well, thank you, Professor. So, Professor, final question. I just appointed you chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. So based on your research, what actions, if any, would you take as PCAOB chair to improve the PCAOB's inspection program?
I love that question, Jeff. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be PCAOB chair, at least for a few minutes. So I acknowledge that being in the position of chair is not easy, and that every decision the chair makes has to be carefully weigh many viewpoints and pros and cons. So as I think about this question, I think my priority would be to ensure that the PCAOB is transparent about its decision-making process, particularly in its consideration of the full range of pros and cons of its options. I think it's important to acknowledge that no one person or organization is ever perfect, but it's important to be open to constructive criticism and strive for continuous improvement. So that would be my goal for the PCAOB. My perception is that the PCAOB is currently taking a more coercive approach to enforcing its rules and standards. And if I were PCAOB chair for a day, my hope would be that I would take a less coercive and more behaviorally persuasive approach to improving audit quality. And based on our findings from our interviews, I would probably take a few actions when I would be appointed as chair. One would be to enhance communication and guidance, particularly with NAF firms or for NAF firms. I think that's already starting to happen, and the PCAOB is trying to issue its inspection reports quicker. I know that this year they were able to get their 2023 inspection reports out by August of 2024. So that is a huge improvement. And I know they're trying to improve their communication with NAF firms. And one of the challenges they're experiencing is that the firms may not necessarily take that opportunity to communicate with the PCAOB, even if the PCAOB opens up communication channels. And I think that's an important challenge to try to overcome, in the sense that it feels like a catch-22. The PCAOB wants the firms to communicate, and the firms want to communicate with the PCAOB. But I think what's stopping them or preventing them from doing so is perhaps either not believing that that open communication channel is genuine, or being afraid that communicating with the PCAOB can open them up to more scrutiny. So to the extent that we can make it easier for them to communicate and not be afraid to communicate, and do so in person, meetings with PCAOB inspectors and staff, I think that would be helpful. And to the extent that the PCAOB can put more resources into its NAF program with dedicated inspectors, not just those that come from the GNF program, but those that are trained and dedicated to the NAF program, and have inspection teams and remediation teams that are consistent year to year, inspection to inspection, I think that would be helpful in improving audit quality at the NAF firms. Now, the other thing that I would probably address as PCAOB chair would be the nature or format of PCAOB inspections. So pre-COVID, a lot of inspections were in person. Some were remote, but a lot of them were in person. When COVID-19 happened, all the inspections went remote. And even after the pandemic sort of withered away and we're kind of sort of back to normal, The inspections for NAF firms have continued to be largely remote, while for larger engagements or GNF firms, there might be more of a mix of remote and in-person inspections. And we also heard in our interviews that the remote inspection format doesn't lend itself as much to communication with inspectors and learning from the inspection process, that there are certain challenges and constraints in talking over Zoom as opposed to being in person for a week with inspectors. And that allows for a better understanding of what the deficiencies are and perhaps how to remediate them. So my plan would probably be to try to either have more in-person inspections or somehow change the format of remote inspection to allow for more dialogue and more opportunity for interaction between inspectors and the engagement team. And then I guess finally, one thing that our paper raises one issue is potential increase in audit market concentration, because smaller firms, especially Triennial inspected firms, seem to be choosing to leave the PCAOB audit market because either they have challenges keeping up with the standards or remediating, or they just decide that they no longer want to deal with the PCAOB. So in the past year, we've had quite a few firms who we've seen drop their SEC issuer clients and stop doing PCAOB audits, even though they're large enough and certainly capable enough of continuing to do so. So one of my priorities would be to try to improve competition in the smaller firm audit market, because I believe that competition and choice promotes audit quality as well. So those are my hopes and dreams if I were PCAOB chair for a day or a few minutes.
Well, thank you. That concludes our podcast episode. On behalf of the Council of Institutional Investors, I want to again thank my special guest, Ali Zimmerman, the Madeline Duncan Rowland Associate Professor of Business Administration at Florida State University. If you have any questions or comments regarding this podcast, please feel free to contact me at Jeff, that's JEFF, at CII.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney. Thanks again for listening to the Voice of Corporate Governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.